Something changed in this war overnight, and it was not a small change. For more than 2 weeks, this conflict had already been violent, already dangerous, already wider than many officials wanted to admit. But the last 24 hours appear to have marked something more serious, a shift from heavy escalation to coordinated regional pressure across multiple fronts at the same time. And that is the kind of change that can push a war into a much harder phase to control. In one night, strikes hit northern Israel, Iraq, and Erbil. Civilians in Israel were wounded. An American KC-135 refueling tanker was lost over Iraq. A French military installation in Erbil was struck, killing a French soldier and injuring others. 3 theaters, 3 different target categories, 3 different political consequences. And that is exactly why this matters. This no longer looks like a conflict operating inside older, unwritten limits. It looks increasingly like a war in which Iranian-aligned forces are applying synchronized pressure across separate arenas to stretch defenses, widen uncertainty, and raise the cost for every country involved. And that is where the story gets more dangerous. Because once attacks are no longer isolated, once they begin arriving as part of a coordinated pattern, the battlefield changes, the decision-making changes, the risk of miscalculation changes. What happened overnight was not just another round of strikes. It was a message that this war may now be entering a new structure entirely. The strike on northern Israel matters for a reason that goes beyond the casualty number. Yes, 58 people reported wounded is serious on its own, but the deeper significance is geographic. This was not described as a strike on an immediate border zone, where cross-border fire has long been part of the logic of confrontation. This reached into the lower Galilee, and that matters because geography in a war like this is never just geography. It is a statement about range, access, confidence, and the changing boundaries of what the attackers believe they can now hit. That is what makes this chapter of the story more unsettling than a single impact site. For years, even during dangerous periods of escalation, there were still assumed limits in the minds of governments, militaries, and civilians. There were places thought to be more exposed, and places thought to be relatively safer. But once strikes begin reaching deeper, those assumptions start to break down. And when those assumptions break down, public fear rises fast because people no longer feel they are living near the war. They feel the war is moving toward them. That also places pressure on Israel's defensive systems in a different way. Even if officials say most threats were intercepted, the public judges the situation by what still got through. And when images from impact zones start circulating, the argument is no longer just about technical interception rates. It becomes about whether the old defensive comfort is fading. And this is why the strike matters. It was not only an attack, it was a warning that the map of vulnerability may now be changing. The loss of the KC-135 over Iraq may become one of the most revealing episodes in this entire conflict, not only because of what happened, but because of how it was described. Official language matters in war. When an aircraft is said to have crashed, that wording leaves room for accident, malfunction, navigation error, or some other non-hostile cause. But when Iranian-aligned factions claim they brought it down, the meaning of that event changes immediately. Then the question is no longer just whether a plane was lost. The question becomes whether the public is being given a version of events designed to soften the true scale of battlefield vulnerability. And that is where this story gets politically dangerous. Because if a major American refueling aircraft was successfully targeted, then this is not just another battlefield incident. It suggests that forces aligned with Iran may be able to threaten high-value U.S. air assets in a way that cuts directly against the public image of control. A refueling tanker is not symbolic equipment. It is part of the infrastructure that makes wider air operations possible. Losing one carries military meaning beyond the immediate deaths involved. It also deepens a pattern. When multiple aircraft losses in the same theater are repeatedly explained through non-hostile language, while adversaries publicly claim responsibility, credibility starts to erode. And once credibility erodes, every future statement becomes harder to trust. So this chapter is not really about one tanker alone. It is about the widening gap between the official narrative of stability and the battlefield signals, suggesting that this war is becoming more dangerous, more contested, and far less manageable than leaders may want the public to believe. The strike on the French installation in Erbil may prove to be one of the most politically consequential developments in this war, because it touches a line that had not yet been crossed in the same way before. A French soldier was killed, others were wounded, and that immediately changes the character of the story. Up to this point, much of the escalation had centered on Iran, Israel, the United States, and the wider proxy network surrounding them. But when a NATO member's military personnel are killed by Iranian-aligned forces on Iraqi territory, the crisis stops looking like a regional confrontation with distant global implications. It starts looking like a conflict that can pull European powers more directly into its gravity. That is why the response from Paris matters so much. France now has to decide whether this was an isolated attack to be condemned or part of a broader pattern that demands a firmer answer. And that decision will not be made in a vacuum. It will be made inside a NATO framework, inside a European security environment already under strain, and inside a war where every response risks inviting another layer of escalation. This is also where deterrence starts to look weaker than many assumed. There was an implicit belief that the political weight of NATO membership would create caution around targeting French personnel. But once that assumption breaks, the message to every other government in the theater is clear. Old protective limits may not hold. And that is what makes this chapter so dangerous. France is no longer just watching the conflict widen. It is now one of the countries directly touched by its consequences. What happened overnight only makes full sense when you stop looking at these events as separate attacks and start seeing them as parts of a larger operational design. This is no longer just a direct clash between Iran and its main adversaries. What the last 24 hours suggest is that the wider network around Iran is now functioning in a far more synchronized way than many public narratives had acknowledged. Hezbollah pressure on Israel, militia activity in Iraq, maritime pressure from the Houthis, and direct Iranian missile and drone operations all begin to look less like parallel crises and more like interlocking fronts inside one expanding war. And that changes everything, because a proxy network like this does more than add manpower or geography. It creates strategic depth. It allows pressure to be applied across different theaters at once. It forces defenders to divide air defenses, intelligence focus, command attention, and political bandwidth across multiple urgent fronts. Instead of one battlefield, there are several. Instead of one threat stream, there is a whole system of them. That is what makes the network so dangerous when fully activated. For years, this structure was often described mainly as a deterrent umbrella, something built to discourage direct war by threatening retaliation. But the pattern now described in the sources suggests something more offensive in character, a force multiplier designed to turn any direct confrontation with Iran into a broader regional struggle that becomes harder to contain with each passing day. So this chapter is the hinge of the whole story. Because once the proxy network moves from background presence to active coordination, the war stops being a conflict in one place. It becomes a distributed system of escalation. One of the most important parts of this story is no longer just what is happening on the battlefield. It is the growing gap between what officials say is happening and what the operational record appears to show. That gap matters because wars are not managed only with missiles, aircraft, and troop movements. They are also managed through public perception, political confidence, and strategic judgment. And when leaders repeatedly describe Iran and its aligned forces as degraded, exhausted, or close to losing effective capacity, while major strikes continue across several theaters, those words begin to lose value very quickly. That is where the credibility problem turns into a strategic problem. If the public story says the enemy is running out of options, but the battlefield keeps producing new waves of attacks, deeper strikes, and more complex coordination, then one of two things may be true. Either decision makers are working from a flawed understanding of the war, or they understand more than they are admitting and are choosing to present a calmer version for political reasons. Neither possibility is reassuring, and this matters far beyond messaging, because if leaders misread the real capability of the forces they are facing, then their next military and diplomatic choices may be built on the wrong assumptions. But if they are not misreading it and are instead managing the narrative, then the public may not be getting an honest picture of the costs, risks, and trajectory of the war. That is why this chapter matters so much. Credibility is not a side issue in a fast-moving conflict. It is part of the battlefield. And once it starts collapsing, every official claim that follows becomes harder to believe, especially when the war itself keeps moving in the opposite direction. This is the point where the story stops being about who landed which strike and starts becoming a question of whether anyone involved still has a credible way to control where this goes next. That is the real danger now. Because the old assumptions appear to be breaking one by one. The assumption that the conflict would remain limited, the assumption that proxy forces would stay inside certain boundaries, the assumption that public claims of Iranian exhaustion reflected the actual direction of the war, the assumption that outside powers could support operations without being pulled more directly into the consequences. All of those assumptions look weaker after the last 24 hours. And once those assumptions collapse, containment becomes much harder. This is no longer only a military crisis. It is also a diplomatic crisis, an alliance management crisis, and an economic risk story at the same time. Wider conflict means pressure on shipping, energy, and supply chains. It means governments far from the battlefield start calculating exposure to oil shocks, inflation, and regional instability. It means every new strike can create consequences for people who had nothing to do with the decisions that began the war. So what happens next? That is the most dangerous question of all, because there is no clear answer in the current picture. There is no obvious exit strategy visible in the source material, no stable containment line, no convincing sign that the next wave will be easier to absorb than the last one. And that is the final takeaway. This war is no longer moving like a crisis that leaders are steadily bringing under control. It is moving like a conflict that is widening faster than the political system around it can safely manage.